evening, everyone. I think it's time to get started. So good to see all of you. This must be the forbidden table here. Is that right? Okay. We'll see who sits there, and then we'll know. She said the bad people sit there. Oh yeah, okay. How are you? Everybody okay? There's some sickness going around, so like my wife said to me this morning as I walked out the door, don't get sick. So I'm telling you, don't get sick. Sorry? We got too much going on. She said we can't afford to get sick, right? We're trying to set up a study of Philemon, the briefest letter in the Pauline corpus. And to do that, I'm trying to set the stage in the broadest sense of slavery in the Greco-Roman world. And then after we do that, then I want to go through passages in the New Testament that speak of slavery, whether historical examples or the parables of Jesus, figurative models, these kinds of things. And then once we've done that, then we're going to jump into the letter of Philemon. So, let me just kind of summarize for those of you who maybe weren't here last week, just kind of briefly hit some of the main points we talked about slavery in the Greco-Roman world. So again, I apologize in advance. This is more like lecture. This is more like information, but I think it'll be worth it. I don't promise any spiritual insight tonight necessarily, but I'm hoping if you'll stick with it after tonight, we'll get into some more, you might say, meaningful conversations. Slave was a legal status. There were three categories of legal status. There were freeborn, freedmen, and slaves. It's estimated 30 to 40% of the population of the Greco-Roman world were enslaved peoples, and it provided huge amount of economic stability for the Greco-Roman world. Source, where did slaves come from? From war. Kidnappers, slave traders would kidnap vulnerable. Exposed infants, these are children that were born sometimes or most often with birth defects, but sometimes not, by a child born to a man who had a child through a relationship other than his wife. So these children would be left. It was the man's decision. The woman had no decision in this, to decide to take the child or abandon it, and they would expose the infant, and often they would be found, these children would be found in trash heaps outside major cities, and of course slave traders would go in and pick them up, raise them as their slaves, and then sell them. Of course, children, any child born to a female slave they were enslaved. And there's a rare examples, and we'll talk about this later, about freedmen who would sell themselves back into slavery. Freedmen are people who were once slaves, bought their freedom, and because it was so hard to make it without any support, they would, especially to a benevolent master, they would sell themselves back into slavery. Two kinds of slaves, you might say in the broadest sense. There were household slaves that performed a variety of duties, from menial tasks to high-skilled tasks, or high-skilled. And, menial tasks would be cooking, cleaning, baking, these kinds of things. Also sex slaves. High-skilled labor like scribes or managers, teachers. Most teachers of children were slaves. So a wealthy man would hire a slave to teach his children teach their sons letters, how to read and write. At least scratch out some letters. They wouldn't be necessarily scribally literate. But there are also field slaves, and what we mean by this, slaves that were either worked in agricultural business, that planted and of course reaped, and they would often live in huts close to the field to kind of keep watch over them. There were field slaves that worked in urban businesses, taverns. They would work for entertainment purposes, like in bathhouses. I did fail to mention field slaves also in mines. So they were mines for metal, salt, precious stones. So there's all kinds of slaves. You might say almost all the hard labor was performed by slaves. So we start talking about slaves in society, and they're referred to in the literature as bodies. The most common expression is a body. They were given names by their masters often. If not, they were called like boy or girl, and often the names would be reveal their function, or at least a pet name, like Onesimus means useful, or someone who was one slave name is City Boy or Actor or Luscious, probably a sex slave. Lucky is another name for a slave. So where did we get these slave names? I'll talk more about this tonight, but in the literature they're described, as well as funerary inscriptions. We'll talk about that, how we know these are the kind of names that slaves received from their masters. Slaves were marked, branded, often tattooed, especially if a runaway slave, they'd be tattooed on their face. And they sometimes, if a chronic runaway slave, they would be shackled, and or a collar, a metal collar, would be permanently put around their neck, and it would often have the letters TMQF, which abbreviation for a Latin phrase that means hold on to me since I run away. Slaves could not legally marry, but they did form families. They received many slaves would receive an allowance, and they could use that allowance to spend on themselves, to save, invest, and there's even examples of slaves. These are now high status slaves in powerful men's homes. These slaves often would, some of them would hire, they would buy their own slaves. She had slaves buying slaves. And of course, slaves would save up their money, however they invested. And there's a really interesting story about a slave who is somewhere, I think it was is it Israel? Maybe a story with Herod. Josephus tells this story, now I can't remember where. But a slave who had amassed quite a fortune. He was very thrifty, and he would loan to freedmen. He'd make loans to them, and if the loan was not paid, a slave would have a freedman who's in arrears thrown into a debtor's prison. So the power that exists in this very ordered, not quite a caste society, but a very ordered society, what happens with slaves that rise to huge levels of power and prestige brings about a status inconsistency. I'll talk more about that later as well. Of course, there's the fact that we have this huge group of people called freedmen, and there are a large number of them, tells you that slavery was not something that necessarily had to be permanent. You could buy your freedom. And it was expected, according to Roman custom, that when a slave reached the age of 30, they were often given the opportunity to purchase their freedom and become freedmen. The price was determined by the master, and sometimes it's estimated sometimes the amount was as much as 10 years' salary to buy their freedom. Some very benevolent masters would grant their slaves freedom at the age of 30 without payment. That was rare, but it did happen. This is where I think I left you last time. The number of slaves you've had and the kind of slaves you had were very much a status symbol for the elites, for the retainer class, for the rulers and the leaders. In the Greco-Roman world, as includes Jewish world, we'll talk about some examples of that in the New Testament. So if you had a large number of slaves, especially for very menial tasks, it was a sign of high status. You remember the story I told from Petronius's Satyricon, which talks about these young men are at this party, this dinner party, and they're playing an athletic game, and there was a slave that not only would, if they kick the ball out of bounds, the slave would go and fetch it and bring it back or give him a new one, but also to relieve himself, he didn't go necessarily use a urinal. He had a slave was standing ready with a bucket. And the athlete would call timeout and relieve himself, and then call for another slave over to wash his hands, and then he dried his hands on the head of the slave. And Petronius tells the story. This is a fictional account, but it gives insight into the world, and the other young men are surprised by such menial tasks and so many slaves at the ready, and he says something to the effect like, "You think this is grand, wait until we get to dinner." So there were sex slaves, courtiers that would show up at banquets. They were well known. One of the things that the Greeks were known for, of course, were their lascivious meals, public display of their wealth and power. And the Greek games, the important dignitaries would be invited to these public banquets. And it was very much expected that when you went to one of these banquets and you ate more than you should and drank more than you should, there would be a sex slave at the ready for you. What was that? Someone said the good old days, or what? I don't know whether. So, high-skilled slaves who were owned by powerful masters wielded sometimes more influence than freedmen. Freedmen, especially who were craftsmen or merchants. So, that created contempt sometimes between the freedmen, even if they were of maybe a decurion rank, a higher rank than your typical plebeian rank. If you come into the household of Caesar, and Caesar has a slave that orders you around, there were men of honor that chafed at that, especially if the slave got really kind of caustic and bossy. Slaves functioned as body doubles for their master, so that a crime against the slave was a crime against the master, according to Roman law. And of course, the classic example, we'll look at this in a minute, but Malchus, who's slave of the high priest, remember when an unnamed disciple in one gospel takes the ear off, and then in the other gospel, he's named. Peter's the one who did it. The slave's name was Malchus, and you could very much suffer harm. You could, if you harmed a slave of a powerful man, or even any person, Roman law protected that slave as property, and if they could function as body doubles, not only if you did harm to that slave, it was an attack on that person, and you could be brought up on charges by Roman law. But get this, you could use your slave to suffer punishment as your surrogate. So if a man has a slave and he's in huge debt and he can't pay it and he's got to go to the debtor's prison, he would send his slave in his place to take the imprisonment or beating. If it was required that a person is to be beaten, a person was to be beaten, then he could put his slave forward to take the beating, take the punishment in his place. According to Epictetus, who was a philosopher who was also a slave, I think he was a slave of a really powerful man in Caesar's household. And so he got to see slavery not only, from the inside of a very comfortable life of a powerful man of Caesar's household. I think it was Nero had I think like maybe a manager or some sort of financial manager, and he had a slave, Epictetus, who was philosopher, left behind works of philosophy, taught philosophy to obviously the children of this man as well as others. And remember I mentioned if you have a slave, you could hire your slave out. Like there's a story of somewhere in Asia Minor, I think there was a slave who was a really, really good baker. I mean, everyone raved about his bread. And so the owner made a pretty good living hiring out the baker for special events. Philosopher like Epictetus would be hired out to teach, or someone who was a pedagogue, someone who taught children, would be hired out. Epictetus says the only difference between a freedman, and this is really, really important for our discussions with regards to the letter to the Philemon. The only difference between a freedman and a slave is moral culpability. Meaning, a slave is not morally responsible for the things that slave does in obedience to the master. Now, Epictetus was quick to point out, because there were some people that claimed that because slaves were subhuman, that they were not moral beings. Epictetus argues no, slaves are moral beings. It's just that because they don't have the ability to choose right and wrong, they're not morally culpable. All right, I'm going to say that again because that's really important when we start talking about Paul's advice. Epictetus said that the only difference between a freedman and a slave is moral culpability. It does not mean that a slave is not a moral being. It just means he's not able to choose, that he can choose right and wrong. The slave simply does not have the freedom to do so. He knows what's right and wrong. He just doesn't have the freedom to do it. Runaway slaves were common. Bounty hunters made a living capturing and returning fugitives to their owners. Of course, it was in the power of the master to punish the slave however he chose, runaway as well as an insolent slave that misbehaved. It was his property, so he could fetter the slave. There are examples of masters maiming slaves, blinding, putting their eyes out, even putting a slave to death. And there was no legal protection for that slave. Abused slaves would seek, if they could, seek refuge within, the Latin expression is amicus domini. And if you read any kind of commentary on Philemon, you'll hear about this, and we'll talk more about it later. Amicus domini means friend of the Lord or friend of the master. And so if you were a slave that you believed you were abused by a malevolent master, you had the only recourse available to you would be to go to the friend of your master and to ask that friend of your master to function as a broker. Now, don't misunderstand what this is about. This is not a slave going to a friend of a master and that master being sympathetic to the slave. There may be some sympathy involved, but the purpose was, Roman law protected these slaves because what the friend is trying to do is get them to see the foolishness of destroying their property. So if you were fleeing under amicus domini, then you were not a fugitive, and slave traders would be illegally capturing you and either returning you or reselling you. So that was like the only, you might say, protection is too strong of a word, but it was the only recourse for a slave that suffered from an abusive master. And basically the whole point of it was Roman law, this is Augustan law, the law under Augustus said, the point of this is to try to talk sense into the master so as to preserve his property. It would be a foolish waste of money to abuse a slave where it is no longer productive or obedient. I've got two more things to talk about before we start looking at the New Testament, but before I go look at these two things, do you have any questions about some of those social realities of slavery in the Greco-Roman world? Give you a chance to drink water. Okay, go ahead, Dana. Right.
Did the master have an obligation to take care of that?
No. There was no, that's right. There was no obligation. I mean, okay, no legal obligation. There may have been, put it like this, the honor is incredibly important as a social prod for behavior, for virtuous behavior. Because honor was the ultimate sign of success, not money. Although money is power in the Greco-Roman world, whereas the Jewish, the Jewish world, it's a part of that. It was your honor. And what is honor? Honor is your social status, your social significance that is confirmed by your people. So one of the things honorable men did is that they would walk through the city with their entourage, filled with their clients. And these are freedmen who are they're like employees of the business, but also slaves. So there are stories about someone of great honor strolling through one of the towns of the Mediterranean world with 50 in tow, 50 different people in tow, men. Clients and slaves. And just the sight of a huge entourage was a signal of honor. But what these clients and slaves would do is they would speak about how honorable this person was, especially if he was a benevolent master. So if he's a really kind master, benevolent, it raised his honor in the eyes of his contemporaries. So malevolent masters you couldn't climb the social ladder by being a malevolent, kind of hateful, mean person. They were often considered as dangerous. They weren't pariahs necessarily, social pariahs, but they were, they were people you just don't want to deal with. And so think of The Godfather, okay? So anybody watch the movies The Godfather? Any of them? That's a great insight into this world. It really is. The paterfamilias. So this paterfamilias, who's a godfather, and he controls the interest of his sons and their daughters, his wife, his clients, his slaves. He controls their interest completely until he dies. The inheritance is divided among them according to Roman law, but they don't realize it until he's dead. So any decision they make that regards money, they have to get his permission. So if you are a powerful man, honorable man, then what you're going to display publicly would be honorable. You want to increase your honor. Now, does that mean there's no honorable man that was involved in shady businesses? Oh, no, they were. Just like The Godfather, they don't want to get in drugs, that story. Well, that's for low life. So you used clients, slaves, to do shady business to keep at a distance from you. So all of this attends to the question, why would a master beat his slave? Well, if you've got a slave, or maim or blind or whatever, or shekel them, if you've got a slave that is a persistent runaway, and you are an honorable man, your public reputation is honorable, then the people would be, especially if it was a slave that caused trouble, or if a slave was not only disobedient to you, but dishonorable to other people, the powerful men would say, he might as well just kill that guy. You might do away with your slave. Do away with him. But if you could find a job for them that requires just their hands but not their eyes, believe it or not, that would be a sign that you are a thrifty master. Thrifty, meaning you're being smart, you're being wise. Because this is property you paid for. See what I'm saying? So what looks to us like, well, that would be, his honor. No. It could be, if he has that social reputation for being incredibly honorable, benevolent, and that he's bought a slave, and by the way, when you go to buy a slave, it's required, Roman law required you to know its ethnicity. We talked about that. Roman law required you to know not only the ethnicity of the slave, but its skills and trade, and if it has run away before. The current owner has to disclose that. It's like a disclosure when you buy a house. You've got to disclose all this stuff. So if you're a benevolent master and you've bought a slave, and either it proves to be a difficult slave, or you bought one and it was under false pretenses, and it becomes public, and he would count on, he wouldn't defend himself, but he would count on the clients and the other slaves going, oh, this man is so good, this Onesimus, he's horrible, and I don't know why he just doesn't deal with the body. But it would be considered maybe wise to shackle a slave, to continue to bake the bread, or, gouging is not all that common, but still. Does that help? Yeah.
Don't you think we get sort of caught up in, when we read the English translations and we read words like just and justice, they're sort of synonymous with fair, whereas to a Greek or in the Greco-Roman world, influenced by Plato, Plato's Republic, justice is more about order. It's not about fairness. It's everything is in its strata in the Republic, so to speak, and as long as each strata is in its lane, performing its function, that is a just society, no matter how unfair or cruel it might express itself in any particular individual circumstance.
That's exactly right. And what underserves that is, again, it's not a strict caste system because there is some upward mobility, but there are huge prejudices. But what underserves that idea, and this is the Greeks and the Romans believe this as much as Jews, the gods predestined the circumstances of your birth. If you're born to a slave, what do the gods intend for you to be? If you're born to royalty, a king, what then the gods have destined you to be? Right? Hear it? So that's why they see it not just as a kind of a theoretical idea of justice, but they see it as preserving the order that the gods have revealed. Because they also believe the whole world was, the gods, had certain territories they protected. And so it's your responsibility, say in Ephesus, to laud the goddess Artemis. You just do that because you were born in Ephesus. Yeah. So this sense of predestination that we think is so uniquely Paul or Christian, all of them believe this. the expression that would be used is fate.
I'm sorry.
Fate, the goddess fate.
Those said fate, and I thought, I'm getting confused.
Yeah, no, the goddess fate, and that idea that you have been the circumstances under which you were born. It is fate that has decided this is what you are destined to be. What's that? There are a number of reasons why we're glad we were born then, right? Of course, Paul says in Galatians 4, this was the perfect time for Christ to come, in the fullness of time. Yeah, glad he came, not us, right? Okay, yeah. What did you say, Sherry? Yes, and so it's not strictly a caste, because, there's some elements to that, but there were, in a caste system, there's just no moving, there's no mobility. But in the Greco-Roman world, and it's the Greeks more than the Romans, the Greeks believed that peoples should advance their life to make it better for them, and even towns should advance the welfare of their citizens. So it's the Greeks who had the idea of democracy and the polis, these cities that govern themselves, rather than have some kind of oppressive thumb that keeps them under rule. Of course, the Romans filled the vacuum, right? Because Alexander the Great conquered the world, and he said, y'all just take care of yourself, rule yourself. But the Romans believed that peace comes through strength. The Greeks believe peace comes through ideas, Hellenism. The Romans believe peace comes through strength.
Well, if your fate was to be a slave, how could you become free?
That's that idea of upward mobility. So that's why there was some opportunity for upward mobility. Think about a slave that is a slave of Caesar, and let's say he's a scribe, and so he amasses a fortune and then buys his freedom and becomes a powerful person. There's an example of some upward mobility.
So it 100% if that was your fate, you had to remain it.
Yeah, so there's fate and fortune. So these two gods are whimsical. And so the moral philosophers and the write the plays, they talk often a lot about fate and fortune. There's an interplay. Yep, Fortunatus is 2K and his fate, and Fortunatus is fortune. Luck.
Hey, Rodney, I have a question. So I'm a slave of Steph and Tom, and I don't like the way they're treating me and they're beating me, so I decided to go to his friend Richard and Sandra. But they decide, yeah, he's not really being that bad.
Right.
It's gonna really be bad to have.
Oh, that's right. That's exactly right. You basically, again, runaway slavery, they recognize that it has more to do with, again, it's not for the welfare of the slave, it's to protect the master's property. And it's hard for us to hear that. But let's say a master loses his temper and he just goes crazy and starts just, has a problem with temper, and he's abusing the slave, and that slave is of course fearful for its life, but as far as Roman law is concerned, what the amicus domini does is protect the property of the master. So that if he runs and the friend comes and says, you just need to settle down. Yeah, you're right. And so it's in the best interest of the master to treat his property with not respect, what's the word? It's like anybody. When you buy, here's a personal example. You spend a lot of money for a truck. Right? Huh?
That truck be red?
It's red. And Sherry still makes fun of me. I park way over there. yeah, I want to take care of it. But let's say if I was being reckless with it, and I had a friend who said, "Hey, man, don't you think you need to change the oil in that thing?" I wouldn't get mad at the truck. Oh, yeah, you're right. Or you need to be quick being so rough with it. It's not going to last. That's the thinking behind this. Don't think of the slave as someone who is anything more than a tool. But it would be in the slave's business thing, I keep getting beaten with an inch of my life, and to save its life, I keep saying it to help you think about it. It might go to a friend of this master or her master.
Johnny, what would be the relationship if the master had a slave that purchased a slave?
He owned it. So if a slave buys a slave, the master owns both those slaves. But he would, So let's say you're a scribe, and you're high skilled, and you're somewhere in the Roman Empire. You're a slave of a senator, and you're a scribe, and you've got quite a bit of influence. And you're sick and tired of going and making your own paper, and you don't want to go to the market and buy papyrus. It's too expensive. And so you would buy a slave to make it for you. Teach you how to make the paper, teach you how to make the ink, teach you how to make the pens. It's like having a secretary keeping your pencil sharp. I don't do that, by the way. Or make the coffee for me, that kind of thing. Yeah. But the master owned both slaves. Okay, let's talk about any other questions? These are really good questions. The moral just to give you a heads up, the moral culpability that Epictetus is delineating, okay, that slaves are moral beings, but they don't have to, and they know right from wrong, but they don't have the power to do it, so they're not culpable for their behavior. That's going to come into play when we think about sex slaves and Paul's advice to slaves. Okay? Just putting it out there. Manumission. Freedman was a legal status, of course, and it reveals that many slaves were freed. Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians 7. We're going to look at this passage more carefully later. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 20, if you'll turn there, this would be really interesting just to put it before you as we think about freedmen and slaves. Look, I'll tell you what, I'll start with verse 17, because Paul has this same language about how the Lord predestines or assigns you to a, right? So look at this, 1 Corinthians 7:17, Paul writes. 7:17, what did I say? Okay, 7:17. Now, this whole passage, Paul's talking about marriage and sexual relationship with husband and wives. He's talking about abandoned spouses, whether husbands or wives, and married to unbelievers, all these kind of things. He's trying to negotiate these issues in a house church setting. Okay, so now, verse 17. Only as the Lord has assigned each one, hear it, as God has called each, in this manner let him walk, and thus I direct all the churches. Was any man called already circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised, whatever that means. Has anyone been called in uncircumcision? Let him not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, uncircumcision is nothing, but what matters is keeping the commandments of God. Let each man remain in that condition in which he was called. Were you called while a slave? Do not worry about it. Do not worry about it. But if you are able also to become free, rather do that. For he who was called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freedman. Likewise, he who was called while free is Christ's Slave, you were bought with a price. Do not become slaves of men. Brethren, let each man remain with God in the condition in which he was called. Really revealing text, isn't it? But it just goes to show you that even in Paul's day, he's talking about an opportunity where slaves could buy their freedom. According to Augustine law, there were three separate categories of laws pertaining to these three things. First, there was a limited number of slaves that an owner could release in any 1 year. There were a limited number of slaves that any owner could release in any 1 year. And that's to try to maintain some economic stability. Second, there were age limits. An owner no younger than 20 was allowed to release a slave. So if you were 20 or younger, if you had a slave, you could not give them freedom or let them buy their freedom. And no slave younger than 30 could be released. So no owner younger than 20, no slave younger than 30. And third and finally, freedmen were not granted citizenship automatically. If you were a slave, if you had a chance to buy your freedom and you're 30 and you buy your freedom, even though your master may be a citizen of Rome, that does not make you a citizen. As a freedman, you have to buy your citizenship. And often that citizenship came at I can't remember how many years of salary it would take to buy your citizenship. Here's what's interesting. Freed slaves would often remain in the power of their master. They would continue perhaps even to live with the patron. They function now as a client, as a freedman, and they would share their earnings with their patron, with the paterfamilias. They would follow the advice of their paterfamilias, marriage, business. And sometimes some slaves would even continue to perform the same duties. That would be especially true for a benevolent master. Let's say it's a benevolent master who has the habit of either releasing their slaves at 30 or giving them opportunity to buy it at a very, very small sum with a small price. And that slave would go, I'm a freedman, but I don't want to get out there in that scary world without any social security, any support. Because you didn't have a family you could rely upon, right? Because you were a slave your whole life. And so the slave would often, but as a client now, this patron, and would start earning its own money, but it would sometimes would seek permission to stay within the home or even in the slave quarters. And they would even perform the same duties. And here's an example of, it's, I can't remember, I think it's Justin who tells this, that there was an example of a sex slave who was freed, but the master only freed the sex slave with the stipulation that she would continue to submit to her former owner. And so she did that. She has her freedom. She can now get married, have children, but she would remain under the power of the desires of her former owner. Some freedmen, of course, had such a difficult time living on their own. We mentioned this. They would sell themselves back into slavery. And so Roman law, this is, I think, after Augustine. I think this came under Claudius, I think. If a slave if a freedman sold themselves back into slavery, they could never be freed. It was permanent at that point. Sorry? Did slaves revolt? Oh yeah, the Spartan, the famous Spartan War. Sorry?
Kirk Douglas.
Yeah, Kirk Douglas. Yeah, I mean, they would, yes, that's why slaves would often be dispersed, even a conquered people. And they would be removed and sold and put in there so that they couldn't, band together and start a revolt. But it did happen every once in a while. Again, we assume that it should happen more often, but it's hard for us to accept this, all right? There were people who had a better life being a slave than not. And the slaves that had such a horrible life, like in the salt mines, they were shackled. They were treated like animals. I mean, under guard by soldiers, and they didn't have anything. They couldn't. Yeah.
We have that today, people doing crime so they can go to prison and get medical, get dental and free meals and.
There's some people. I mean, I had a cousin who he died when he was in his 40s. He was an addict, heroin addict, and he once told me it was easier in the joint than out here. That's what he said. But that's not the case for all people, and we don't want to romanticize prison, federal prison, or this situation. But again, it was they can't imagine life without slavery, okay? It's not like, wow, there was a period of freedom and now all of a sudden people are starting getting enslaved. No, slavery was pretty much a part of that world for centuries. I mean, look at the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament. There were slaves, and we're not even going to look in the Old Testament, there's slaves everywhere in the Old Testament. The famous story of Joseph, but there were even sex slaves. Abraham had sex with with Sarah's slave. So that's just the way it was. That's just the way they couldn't conceive of life without it. And that's an important point to make, because again, we look at this from an Enlightenment perspective, and through the glass darkly, the jaundiced lens of view of our own blight in human history, American slavery. But in their day, slaves were as common as minimum wage workers. And I'm not saying they're the same, okay? Minimum wage workers are not enslaved. I think that's a category mistake. But think about how would our economy work without minimum wage workers? What would that be like? For those of us who are the haves, and we kind of like those cheap workers. But that's another matter. So the final, yes, go ahead, Roy. Yeah, that's a good question, and you didn't have very many slaves that made it to that age. Well, especially the ones that are doing hard labor, menial tasks, they wouldn't last past their 20s. But some of the more high-skilled slaves who could actually, or if they were a household slave, field slaves wouldn't last. But household slaves, especially if they became a member of the family that was, considered important. Think The Help. You might see the film The Help. Think that. There'd be an attempt to, maybe foster a life for them, but it would always be in connection with the household, always. And so those kind of slaves might have a better chance of reaching the age of 30. I think the estimate is only and these are difficult numbers to really nail down specifically, but the best estimate is that only 1 of 5 people in the Greco-Roman world made it past the age of 30. Because of disease, war, accidents. Like in their day, if you have a broken leg, it's fatal, yeah. Now you know why the temple of Asclepius, the god of healing, he did a bang-up business. I mean, you talk about a high-paying job is to be a physician for Asclepius, a priest for Asclepius. They in I think, was it Sardis, somewhere in Asia, in Turkey, they found a temple to Asclepius, represented as a python. So that's where the medical python comes from, the snake. They found casts of different portions of the human body. And the whole thing is they would bring the part of the body they wanted to be healed, they would make a cast of it. So a hand or an ear or an eye or a mouth or a leg, and they would come to Asclepius and pay, hoping that the spell and often the spell, the prescription was, we would read it as it would be like witchcraft, the strange things they would require. To get over this rash, you need to find crow's feet and the herb that grows in such and such a place, and grind it and then mix it into a paste with a certain kind of berry, and then rub it on the infected area, turn around 3 times, face the temple, and say this nonsensical incantation, and you would get healing. I mean, that's the prescriptions that we read, for example, in the magical papyri. Wild stuff, right? But the hundreds of these casts, images of the different parts of the body were just amazing. It shows you how desperate people were, who were maimed, sick, diseased. Yes, sir.
Like in Matthew 25, parable of the talents, most likely the slave that got the 5 and the 2 talents, they traded work. Most likely, what would they have done to that gain?
So that's a really good question, and we're going to talk about that actually next Wednesday. I've got one more thing to say about background, but the next thing we're going to do is look at slavery in the New Testament. We're going to start with the parables of Jesus and look at the dynamics of how slavery operated, at least in the Jewish part of the Greco-Roman world. And it'll fill it out more, some of these questions. But let me make one more point and then we're done, okay? The last thing I have in my notes for slavery in the Greco-Roman world is this issue of upward mobility. We've been talking about it. There are some rags to riches stories that slaves who become, and the only rag to riches story for the most part in the literature, for entertainment, for plays, and like in Euripides and Sophocles and all these plays, right? The rags to riches story that's popular, it's common, the people love it, is a slave that rises above their slave status. Most often, a slave that was kidnapped. A freedman who was kidnapped, put into slavery. It's like Gladiator, okay? Kidnapped, put into slavery, and they show that they are more than that. They're actually noble and powerful. That story in Gladiator is the most common rags to riches story in the Greek literature. They loved this story. The elites did. In the funerary inscriptions on these monuments, you have many expressions. A slave, you give a slave name, and then a slave of, and then their master, that revealed their social status, their embedded honor. Okay? That was really, really important. If you were a slave of a powerful man, then you had embedded honor. That's why when they were buried, they would even be buried with the pet name their master gave them, whatever it was, but then they quickly add a slave of, doulos of, and this powerful, honorable person. And often the slaves would be buried in the same mausoleum as the owner. Okay? And so it's better to be a slave of a powerful owner than among the freedmen of ordinary means. So I want to end with this. I'll have one little spiritual encouragement as we've waded through this dark world of the Greco-Roman context for Philemon, and that's this. It wasn't until Dale Martin wrote his book, Slavery and Salvation, or Slavery as Salvation, and I'll bring up Professor Martin. He died a couple years ago. I'm going to bring up his work as we go through Paul. He says this: we have misread Paul's letters. Like in Romans 1, Paul says, Paul, a slave of Jesus Christ? We think it's an act of self-deprecation. No, he's claiming honor. He's claiming honor. I'm a slave of the most powerful man that ever lived. You better listen to me. See how that changes the way you understand what's being written. And I hope that little insight will help us as we continue to look at parables of Jesus. And after we look at parables, we're actually going to look at first a number of historical examples in the New Testament. Then we're going to look at the parables of Jesus. Then we're going to look at Paul. And all of that will set us up for Philemon. Isn't this fun? I know it's a dark subject, but oh, this is good stuff. See you next time.